Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Rye.
And I'm Courtney.
And we're in the middle of an indefinite self-care series, and we're focusing at this point on emotional well-being and resilience. And resilience, we mean like how we weather the storm and bounce back from setbacks. And last week, we were very fortunate to talk to our first guest, Nicole Woodward. And Nicole talked with us about our theme for the year at the St. Croix River Ed District, which is grace, grit, and growth. And I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode if you missed it, because Nicole is a great person to chat with. When we were talking about grace last week, we dipped our toes a little bit into a conversation about how we spend our energy. And there are some things that we control directly, some things that we can influence, and some things where we can't do either of those. We can't control it, we can't influence it. And we're going to explore that a little bit more today, because learning to focus our energy where it counts is really important to our resilience.
Before that, though, what is filling our buckets this week? I will go first. So I ended up taking a sick day yesterday. I woke up with all the intentions of working, and my head just hurt so much I couldn't even focus. And I was just super thankful because all of my colleagues that I had meetings with or scheduled time with were super supportive and kind and wished me well. And it was just it's really nice to work in such a supportive organization. What about you, Rye?
Well, this week I had two of my three girls pick out two friends that they wanted to do like a 12 days of Christmas Secret Santa thing with. And it started on Tuesday. And we started delivering our like little Secret Santa little presents to their homes, and yesterday we got busted by two of them. So out of four, we got busted by two, and we have 10 more days to go to deliver these Secret Santas. But it's just been really fun to get the girls excited about giving and see their friends post stuff on their parents' social media page about how excited they are to receive the gifts and stuff. So it's filling others' buckets, but it's also filling my own bucket.
That's awesome. What's filling my bucket is what was filling Rye's bucket a couple weeks ago. Is I finally got a chance to put up our Christmas decorations and Christmas lights, and it's just bringing me a lot of joy. Every year, I think I Google like what to do with Christmas lights, how to keep that going year round, because you're not supposed to leave up the Christmas tree year round, even though I want to. There's got to be some solution to how to get basically a similar object in your house that can be covered in twinkly lights all year round and have it be socially acceptable. So if anybody listens and has an idea and can share that with me, just know I'd really appreciate it, because Googling hasn't yielded me a solution so far.
I think so when I redid that hutch, one of the things that I like to do every season is find something that lights up and put in there. And it's so wonderful. So I have tons of lights in my little decorative hutch, and that just makes me feel good. And it lights up all night, just like the Christmas tree would. It's the bomb.
Oh, and that reminds me of, we've been talking as a team outside the podcast about the, I think it's Danish, the concept of hygge. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That's what I was going to bring up.
I was teaching Rye about hygge, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, but it's like Hyggge, and it's a Danish, and I think other Scandinavian countries have a similar idea, because they're up north and they have so much darkness for so long of the year, and it's so cold, kind of like Minnesota, but probably worse, which I can't imagine. So they, as a culture, have this idea of like pursuing comfort and warm vibes, and twinkly lights are a big part of that. So they're really they burn more candles, I think, than any other country, I think is one of the things I read. But anyway, we could talk about hygge all day. Let's shift to our main topic. As I mentioned, last week we were talking about grace, and, we're gonna make mistakes. We are not perfect. And sometimes, as Nicole said, we get stuck. I like that phrase she used, like we're at a stuck point. And that could sound like, I've never done this before. Where do I even begin? If I do this, I'm going to fail. There's so much to work on. I don't know where to start. that one is where I'm at today. Just feel like so many tasks and where do we start? Like it's that stuck point. And something I brought up last week when we were talking about grace is these spheres of control. And it's not spheres of influence. If you Google spheres of influence, you're going to get a lot of historical geopolitical stuff coming up about countries, just FYI. So it's spheres of control. This is an idea where we can look at the challenges and stressors in front of us and decide which ones we can control directly and which ones we can influence in some way and which ones we can't do either with, like we can't control or influence them. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today comes from Elena Aguilar's book, Onward. We've mentioned this in the podcast before, and it's a great book the three of us are reading. It's about emotional resilience for educators. And Elena happened to have written an article about the concept we're talking about today, these spheres of control for Education Week. So you can read that and we'll link it into the show notes. And Elena comes at this concept from the perspective of change. And she says, change is inevitable. Like it's going to happen to us whether we like it or not. And 2020 has certainly reminded us of that. If it wasn't apparent before, change is going to happen to us whether we like it or not. And like some examples, our county case numbers, like our learning model can just suddenly change. And it has, because county case numbers of COVID are rising. And it's just, that's happening around us. What Elena reminds us of as educators is resilient people have more self-efficacy than less resilient people. So this is like a habit we learn to, in challenging situations when change is happening to us, we look to expand our agency, like how much action we can take, like our capacity to take action and have more control or feel like we're having more control and influence over what's happening around us. And that makes us more resilient. And even if that's just like changing and influencing the way that I'm responding to what's happening around me, like finding some way to feel like I'm controlling and have some control over the situation and what's going on. So we're going to walk through an activity that Elena uses when she's coaching teachers. And this is in the book we're reading, but it's also on the website that I referenced earlier. So we're going to link it into the show notes in case you want to, look at the steps later on.
All right, so step 1 is you're going to make a list of the things that you've complained about or wanted to complain about, like maybe in the last week or so. The big stuff and all the little stuff. Could be the weather, having a ton of work to do, or not sleeping well. Maybe a coworker or a friend that's been frustrating you, possibly your kids fighting with each other.
And next, you're going to sort each of those complaints into, like I say, buckets. So bucket number 1 is things that are within my direct control. Bucket number 2 would be things that I can influence in some way. And bucket number 3 would be things I can't do either of those with, either outside of my control or influence. And we've got a poster on the website that we're going to link into the show notes as well that kind of makes a visual for this. And they're literally like spheres of control. So the innermost one is things that I control. A little bit wider one is things that I influence. And then the furthest one out is everything else. So things that are outside of my control or influence.
That third step is going to be just to notice what category the majority of your complaints fell into.
And step number 4 is you're going to read the complaints that are outside of your control and influence and just try and notice what effect that has on your body. Because typically looking over those things that make us feel helpless, that we feel like we can't control and influence, does increase our stress level and drain our energy to think about. So you might feel your shoulders tightening up or your breath getting a little bit more shallow reading over those things.
So the 5th step is of the complaints that you identified as being outside of your control, are there any that you could look at differently so you could have more control over them? So things that we can't control, some examples of that would be like mandatory curriculums, teacher salaries, the coronavirus's effect on our learning models that we're in. So Elena pointed out that she couldn't control these things, but that she could influence how she felt about them. So her state of almost constant low-level frustration and that satisfaction was within her sphere of control or influence.
Yeah, so like she couldn't control the mandatory curriculum she was using. I think that's an example she wrote about quite a bit in her book. Like earlier in her teaching career, she was at a school and she didn't like the curriculum she was supposed to be using. And she found like she was like low-key frustrated pretty much all day, and especially when she had to use that curriculum. And she just recognized, like, I can't control this. I can influence it, but it's going to take time, and I might not have the capacity to do that right now. Like, I'm a new teacher. I'm learning a lot. I might not have capacity for that. So what I can influence is how I feel about it and how I respond to it, and trying to work on, like, not carrying that frustration with me all day. Number 6, of the complaints that are outside of your control, are there any that you'd like to let go of? And I'm just going to add to this, like, I think pausing is another way to look at this too. Because sometimes I'm not letting go of those things permanently. Sometimes you just want to pause them, and like later on, I might find a way to influence them. But Elena has a nice visual for this, like, you know, take that thing that you can't control or influence right now and like feel like you're attaching it to a helium balloon, and then just let it like drift away. Like, just letting go of this for now.
And the last step is to look at the complaints that are within your sphere of influence and control. See if you can identify one concrete action that you could do to address each one of those complaints. So thinking about this can bring us clarity and help us use our energy more wisely. So first, it shows us that we don't control everything, but we do have control over how we respond to what happens. It also teaches us that we can influence a lot of things like teacher salaries, education policy, curriculum, hiring decisions, etc. The main question is, where do we want to put our energy?
And we name this episode What We Choose to Carry, because those things that we can't control and we can't influence, or we just don't have the capacity to influence them right now, they can drain our energy and they can feel like a huge burden. And just like if I'm ruminating about an issue and keeping it at the front of my mind and I can't control it, I'm going to feel helpless about it. And that's going to make me miserable. I've been in that place before as an educator, more times than I probably even like to recall. And that's going to make me less resilient, kind of that constant state of helplessness, because I'm ruminating on this thing that I feel like I can't control or influence right now. And finding a way to either let that go or to reframe it so I find some way to influence it. And, you know, that, again, could just be finding a way to control my response to it and how I'm feeling about it and dealing with it. That's a way to make myself more resilient. So we're going to be brave now and give some examples of times in our own life when we've, like, this has been a relevant concept to our resilience. So a student that I worked with, who was physically aggressive and a very large student, and I found I was spending huge chunks of my day, if not, you know, all day, working one-on-one with the student. And I felt like we weren't making progress, because we kept, you know, ending up physical aggression would happen. I have to respond. And the student was getting a lot of reinforcement and attention from peers when this happened. And it felt like this cycle that kept repeating. And I was in that reactive zone, and I felt like the cycle was just going to keep repeating because the prevention things that we were trying weren't having an effect. And that's not a fun place to be. I've been there before myself. I've worked with a lot of people who've been kind of in that reactive, helpless zone, and it is not a very resilient, fun place to be, and definitely not to stay for a long period of time. So I felt like this was going to keep repeating. And we were reluctant to change like our standard point card system when working with this student, because we wanted that practice to be pretty consistent across our staff. But we just hit a point where we felt like we had to try something different. And I ended up doing a lot of studying of our options for point cards and reinforcement. And we ended up with a system where the student would earn like an edible every couple minutes if he had a safe body. And he had his best string of days ever in the school that he was at the time. And I was so proud, and just found like it took a lot of effort and cooperation and rethinking, but found a way to have a little bit more influence and control over that situation. And I learned a lot from that situation, and I ended up, you know, working with my colleagues to write some more reinforcement guidance for other educators around this while I was watching Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Spent a lot of time working on nerdy guidance while watching horror movies.
All right, I can go next. full disclosure here, Rye's about to get real and vulnerable here. So you may or may not know that I have some significant amounts of anxiety when we have the podcast every week. So, which is funny because the podcast kind of started out as a comment or idea that I actually made about us having a podcast. So full circle here, it's coming around to bite me in the butt, I think. So, but the podcast and actually like professional development in general puts me extremely outside of my comfort zone, especially my career comfort zone. So you listeners may hear some anxiety come through the podcast as you listen, whether it's cracks in my voice or me fumbling over my words. You also might not hear my voice as much because my team maybe understands that I don't necessarily want to share as much, but they are so great to me and are willing to kind of fill in the gaps when my voice is much more quiet than theirs. So with that, each week, we have new episodes and new content, and it doesn't really get any easier because of that. So one of the things that I could kind of influence in this situation was just to share some of those anxieties and that vulnerability with my team. And I knew that I wanted to be a part of it because I knew that the information that we were sharing through this podcast was so important to educators during this time. So after I shared with my team kind of how I was feeling and the anxiety that I was feeling, much like Nick described earlier with the shortness of breath and the tightening of shoulders with like hours before each episode recorded, but especially as I could see my parts kind of come up through the episode, we agreed that we would kind of have a layout or we could prep a little bit before the recording started. And then we also figured out some different editing strategies so that it was okay to mess up and it was okay to pause and go back and start over. So if you listen to some of the earlier episodes where we didn't know all of that, you probably could hear it a lot more. So I'm just so grateful for the grace and the grit and the growth that I have endured just through this podcast and kind of making that full circle. So.
All right, you're going to make us cry.
So cute.
Just so proud of you.
Absolutely. Oh, you guys are great.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think it's just an inspiration because we're all out of our comfort zones right now. Like Nicole was talking last week about grace being so important because we're in these situations we've never been in before. And like, who knew that we were going to be doing a podcast together? So your willingness to just like problem solve and be so incredibly brave, I think is just a great inspiration for other educators out there. So thank you for sharing and being vulnerable.
Yeah, I really do love being a part of this. And I know what we're doing is really great work. So I'm excited. It's just, I got to work through some things and become more resilient. So I appreciate you guys.
We appreciate you. So I can go. Mine is similar to yours, Nick. So I was working with a young lady who had a really tough home life. She was the oldest of many siblings, and I mean many siblings, with a single parent that worked nights. So she often came to school like very much not ready to learn. So I would spend the majority of my day with her in my classroom. No matter what class she was in, she would be with me. It took a lot to get her to go to even like 5 to 10 minutes of class. So I was just constantly urging her to complete her work or letting her vent about things that had gone on. So I knew that what happened when she left the school building was not in my control, but that I could possibly influence by regular communication with her parent and providing strategies to help at home, because I knew that parents struggled with getting all of the kids settled and getting all the work done, getting all the the home stuff done because it was chaos. So I tried to talk to the parent regularly, and that did start to help. But then we also figured that in order to make things easier for her at home, we had to switch up a lot of the things that we were doing at school. So we eliminated homework for her. So anything that she got done within the school day was what we counted for her, because we just knew it was not going to be possible for her to do work from her home. And she didn't have transportation, so we couldn't get her to stay after. It just all felt like we weren't able to do anything to support her. So we met a lot of resistance, not only with the parent, but also with the student herself and with the other staff members that weren't necessarily like part of the team directly making that decision. But we were able to make some progress toward the end of the school year. And then it was time for summer, and then it was time for her to go home for 3 months straight. And it just felt, again, like just a sinking feeling in my stomach, like I have no control over what's going to happen for the next 3 months straight. And I don't know what space she's going to be in. I don't know how she's going to come back in the fall. So it just felt really gross. So I ended up giving her permission to email me. And then throughout the emails, I ended up giving her like a phone number that she could contact me because I was just so worried. I just knew things weren't great. So we ended up communicating a lot over the summer. And she did come back in a better place the next fall. So that felt really good. But it was just really hard because I knew when she's at home, I can't, like, there's nothing I can do. And I don't know. It's just tough to not be able to, we're such problem solvers, I think, you know, in our education world. And then knowing that there's problems that we actually can't influence or do anything about, it was tough.
I think that's a really relatable example, especially since the pandemic started, and especially when we've been in full distance learning last spring and now. I just know I've talked to so many educators who are very worried about, you know, like, not all of our students are, sometimes school is the best place for them, the calmest place, the place where things are most stable, and losing access to that, we all just know how that hurts our hearts as educators.
For sure. It's heavy stuff.
It's heavy stuff. And I think that just brings home, as we're about to transition into takeaways, kind of the overall message we're hoping to get across with this episode and how this relates to our resilience. Like, the 3 stories we shared, it's not about doing exactly what Courtney did. Like, it's not about, like, you have to, you know, give a student your email and do that connection, or you have to go to your coworkers and share this thing. It's not about those details. It really is about kind of that reflection on, these are the things that I can control directly. These are the things that I can have an influence on. But even those, like, maybe I don't have capacity to try and influence them all right now. Like, sure, I could influence education policy, but do I have the capacity to do that right now? And then the things that I can't really influence and control right now. And coming to terms with that and allowing yourself to, like, giving yourself to grace to let some of those things go or to pause them for right now. And then finding a way to take action in the places and put your energy where it counts. I really like that phrase. Like, I've only got a certain amount of energy in my battery as an educator, and I've got to, like, invest that where it counts, because it's easy to get it drained by all these things that bother me, that worry me, that I'm not in a place to take action on or control or influence. And that, you know, again, makes me less resilient and makes it harder to weather the storm. And I'm sure a lot of people listening can really relate to that. Like we sure could when we read that chapter in the book. So with our takeaways, we invite you to keep asking yourself these questions. And we wrote down a couple, like, take a pause sometimes. Am I using my energy on something that I can't control or influence, or something I don't have capacity to influence right now? Like, is that where my energy is going? Another question you might ask yourself, like, is this something I'd like to let go of, or let go of for now, or hit the pause button for now? Or another question, is there a way I can view this situation differently so that I can exert some kind of control or influence on it? Like, what are the choices I can make? And again, that might be talking to coworkers, changing up what you're doing. It might just be using your stress management strategies to help you deal with something and respond to it differently emotionally so that you can get through it. Another question you might ask yourself, like, do I have to feel this way? Can I change that?
That is a wrap. Thanks for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. Until then, we'll see you when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys. Bye.